When we think about certain countries, sometimes a single image pops into mind, right? Maybe shaped by recent news, maybe stereotypes.
Hmm.
But often, there's just so much more going on beneath the surface, a really layered, rich, and frankly, often surprising history.
Absolutely.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into the compelling story of Zimbabwe. We'll go from its ancient civilizations right up to the challenges it faces today.
Yeah.
Our goal really is to pull out the key insights from the source material just to help you get quickly up to speed on this fascinating nation.
That's a great plan. And Zimbabwe, just to set the scene, it's a landlocked country in southern Africa. You've got Zambia, Mozambique, South Africa, and Botswana as neighbors.
Right.
Now, for 90 years, from 1890 right up to independence in 1980, it was known as Southern Rhodesia, ruled by an all-white minority government.
90 years.
90 years. And a really crucial piece of that colonial legacy, something that casts a long shadow, is the incredibly skewed land ownership. At independence, you had about 4,500 white commercial farmers owning roughly 15 million hectares of the best farmland.
15 million.
Yeah, it's vast. And this land wasn't just sitting there. It produced something like 20% of the country's GDP and a huge 60% of its export earnings.
Incredible productivity from such a small group.
Exactly. And as we'll get into, the initial attempts at land reform after independence, well, they didn't really tackle this core imbalance.
Setting the stage for problems later.
Precisely.
Okay.
Laid the groundwork for a lot of conflict down the line.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that. But first, let's rewind way, way back, thousands of years, long before any colonial powers showed up. What can we learn from the pre-colonial history? What were the foundational societies like in this region?
Right. Good question. While human origins in Africa go back millions of years, the specific story of Zimbabwe, the societies there, spans a few thousand years. We see farming populations settling about 2,000 years ago. They went through distinct phases, a late Stone Age, then an Iron Age around 200 CE. Think established settlements, farming, trade.
So organized societies fairly early on.
Definitely. And this evolved into powerful middle-aged states from around 800 CE. What's really striking is how sophisticated these early inhabitants were.
Like the Shona dynasties?
Exactly. The Shona-speaking dynasties like Munumutapa and Manyika, they were politically established, building these impressive stone-faced forts.
Right, the famous stone structures.
Yes, and they were trading gold and ivory, even importing European goods centuries before Europeans physically invaded.
But centuries before. That's fascinating.
It really is. Shows complex external relations. You also had other groups arriving, Nilotics and Swana speakers around the 6th century CE, Nguni speakers settling around the start of the second millennium, interacting with Exosa groups.
A real melting pot even back then.
Yeah, and one side note, the early metalworking and riverside settlements did lead to some localized deforestation and erosion, and early environmental impact.
Interesting. So that brings us to the Great Zimbabwe civilization itself, the one that gives the country its name. What's the standout feature of that ancient power?
Well, the defining thing about the Zimbabwe culture is this practice of building really significant circular homes for the elite.
Inside those big stone walls we see pictures of.
Precisely. Within large, dry stone-walled enclosures, often on terraced hills, commoners lived outside these walls. It was a widespread culture, initially flourishing across the Zambezi region.
Okay.
And a key moment in understanding it came in 1905 with the archaeologist David Randall MacGyver.
What did he find?
He investigated the great ruins in Mashonaland, as they were called, and his conclusion was definitive. The Zimbabwe culture was local. It was an African creation.
That must have been huge at the time.
Oh, absolutely, because it directly debunked these earlier theories, popular during Cecil Rhodes's time, that claimed some foreign origin.
Theories used to justify colonialism, presumably.
You got it, by denying indigenous people could build such things. It's a shame, actually, that despite more archaeological work in the late 90s, wider scholarly interest seemed to dip a bit after that.
So even way back then, before colonialism, were there signs of, say, class structures or hierarchies within these societies?
Yes, definitely. The evidence points towards top-down, elite-driven class structures emerging in the pre-colonial period.
How is that structured?
Your status was often based on how much cattle or land you held. Your village designation also played a role in labor duties and tribute owed. So yeah, a clear hierarchy existed long before Europeans arrived.
Okay, so now we pivot to that moment. The arrival of Europeans, the start of the colonial era. What was driving this sudden, intense European focus on Africa?
Well, in the 19th century, it was this age of exploration, right? Africa just captured the European imagination. You had all sorts of people, enterprising men, women, even kids rushing into the interior.
For different reasons, I imagine.
Yeah, some were after treasure, pure and simple. Others wanted to settle, farm, exploit the resources. You can actually still find traces, old roads, cattle pens along the Zambezi River from those times. And interestingly, while this rush was happening, the Mweni Mutapa Empire, descended from Munhu Mutapa, was still going, still building Zimbabwe's.
Yeah.
And it's important to note, the actual Great Zimbabwe site, never occupied by the Portuguese or the Lemba people.
Right. And then comes the name everyone knows from this period, Cecil Rhodes. What was his big idea, his vision for this place?
Rhodes, yeah, he was apparently consumed by these.
Yeah.
Well, the sources call them fever dreams of vast gold fields.
Gold fever, essentially.
Pretty much, in what some call the land of the golden morning. So in 1888, he sent his employee, a guy named A.G. Rudd,
To do what?
to secure the Alexandra concession. This was meant to give Rhodes a monopoly mining rights, political rights, in Matabele land.
And how did Rudd manage that?
Quite cleverly, or maybe cunningly. He apparently told the Matabele king, Lobengula, that they just wanted to set up a little trading store.
Downplaying the mining ambitions.
Massively, not mentioning the scale of the rights they were actually seeking. Then Rhodes himself makes this dramatic trip to Great Zimbabwe in 1889, sort of surveying his potential prize.
Which leads then to Southern Rhodesia being formally established. Tell us about the Pioneer Column. What was that, and what happened when they arrived?
Right, the Pioneer Column. Sent out in 1890, the sources describe it as an ill-fated expedition, really. It is made up of these impulsive and reckless prospectors and adventurers, plus some missionaries,
And their mission.
to assert occupation, to take control of what Rhodes and the company considered stolen territory, even though it wasn't theirs to claim.
How was it received?
Well, the Matabele forts were apparently quietly abandoned. Seems there was a lot of fear facing this organized incursion. This allowed the column to quickly set up Fort Salisbury.
Oh, no.
The chartered company, Rhodes's company, immediately got to work justifying its new rule, and importantly started grappling with this thorny class question, how to manage and control the indigenous population.
A real turning point.
Absolutely. The sources suggest this is when indigenous people started being seen by the colonizers as unreliable instruments for the ambitions of great white hopes. It ushered in this period described as a mourning for this lost half-century.
That phrase, lost half-century, is powerful, and it leads us right into the next phase, the fight back, the push for independence. When did that struggle really start to gain momentum?
The definite trigger, the absolute turning point, was the white minority government's unilateral Declaration of Independence, the UDI, from Britain, November 11th, 1965.
How did that land with black Zimbabweans?
It was sudden, shocking news, especially in the rural areas. And the realization dawned very quickly. True independence based on equality wasn't going to be handed over. It could only be realized through an armed struggle against white oppression.
So negotiation felt impossible at that point.
That was the feeling, yes, that the door had been slammed shut, leaving armed struggle as the only path forward.
But taking on a state, even a minority one, requires huge resources and support. Where did they find help?
Well, they drew a lot of inspiration from history, their own pre-colonial resistance, but also looking at post-colonial struggles elsewhere in Africa. South Africa, Angola, Nigeria, Congo.
Learning from others.
Exactly. And domestically, black political parties had already started forming back in the mid-50s, so there was some political structure. But the crucial bit was regional support.
From neighboring countries.
Yes, leaders like Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Samora Machel in Mozambique were vital. Zambia, especially being right next door and landlocked, really bore the brunt of the war.
How's so?
They hosted and trained huge numbers of Zimbabwean guerrilla fighters. Zambia became this absolute land of promise for those committed to liberation.
This whole period became known as the Rhodesian Bush War. Who were the main groups fighting for independence, and what did the fighting actually look like?
The fight was mainly led by two rival groups. First, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, formed back in '61, led by Joshua Nkomo. And second, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, initially led by Ndabani-Sitole, but this is a group Robert Mugabe really rose through the ranks of. ZANU was generally seen as more radical.
More radical in what way?
They drew inspiration from figures like Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, ideologically distinct from ZAPU to some extent.
No, itself. on the ground.
It was intense, pervasive. You had everything from guerrilla column ambushes to planting landmines, kidnappings. It touched almost every part of the Rhodesian countryside.
Sounds brutal.
It was. And we have to acknowledge the sources mention rogue elements involved too, who committed violent acts, sometimes against civilians. It was a messy, brutal conflict.
So independence finally comes in 1980. Huge celebrations, I imagine. Immense optimism.
Absolutely. A moment of incredible hope.
But as you mentioned earlier, this colonial legacy didn't just vanish. What were the immediate challenges, particularly around that huge issue of land?
Right. Despite the joy, the Lancaster House Agreement of 1979, which set the terms for independence, had this land issue embedded in it.
The willing buyer, willing seller thing?
Exactly. The government could technically buy land for redistribution, but only if white farmers were willing to sell. Britain provided some funds for these buyouts.
How did that work out in practice?
Slowly. Very slowly. Frustration grew really quickly because the land reform program just wasn't delivering change fast enough for most people.
And who benefited from the land that was redistributed?
Well, the sources suggest it often went to people connected to the ruling party, ZANU-PF, and its comrades. Meanwhile, those large-scale white commercial farmers were largely shielded from any dispossession in those early years.
So the core imbalance remained.
Pretty much. And interestingly, the sources state that initially, nobody in Zimbabwe thought of a radical land reform scheme. It wasn't the immediate plan.
But that changed.
It did. Over time, the goal shifted towards, as the sources put it, to claim the land, kick out the white commercial farmers, and allot the land to black farmers. That shift made future violence almost inevitable.
Beyond land, the new government also tried a socialist-based economic approach. What was the plan there, and why did things start to go wrong economically and politically by the early 90s?
The initial hope was simple. End sanctions, boost trade, get external finance flowing in. The government aimed for state intervention to spread the benefits more equitably.
Based on what model?
Underpinned by import substituting industrialization, trying to build up local industries to replace imported goods.
Sounds logical. What happened?
By the early 1990s, something shifted fundamentally. The sources suggest the government institutionally abandoned the original tenets of nationalism, independence, and democracy.
Abandoned them? How?
Well, public grievances were mounting. You had chronic poverty, widespread disease, severe droughts, just compounding problems.
And people started reacting.
Yes. Trade unions particularly became channels for this growing discontent. It all came to a head on April 2nd, 1998, with Zimbabwe's first national general strike.
A major event.
Huge. It was the first time citizens really openly challenged ZANU-PF's power and its system of patronage politics. A real crack in the facade.
And right at the center of ZANU-PF's power for so long was Robert Mugabe, a hero of the liberation struggle, then leader for decades. Tell us more about his journey and his time in power.
Mugabe's story is quite something. Born in 1924, started as a teacher, studied in South Africa, then spent time broadening his horizons. Mozambique, Malaysia, Ghana, China.
Gaining experience and connections.
Definitely. He was absolutely pivotal in rallying support against the Rhodesian government. He led civil disobedience campaigns from 1964 onwards.
Which were met with force.
Brutal crackdowns, yes. But paradoxically, that harsh response actually helped bring the plight of Zimbabweans to world attention. He was effective to reorganize the movement, rose to leader.
But then came the post-independence era, his long rule from 1980 to 2017. How do the sources characterize that period?
Pretty starkly. They often describe it as a dictatorship. The sources are quite explicit that human rights abuses were commonplace.
What kind of abuse?
Things like unlawful detentions, systematic stifling of opposing views, reports of torture, extrajudicial killings, heavy censorship. A really grim picture.
And the impact on the country?
Devastating. Collapse of social systems, rampant poverty, widespread hunger. Zimbabwe went from being called the breadbasket of Southern Africa to needing to import food.
Wow. Any specific examples cited?
Yes, one mentioned is the March 2017 evictions. Residents apparently evicted without notice, no alternative shelter provided. A clear violation of constitutional rights, according to the sources.
This difficult environment must have affected politics, especially elections. What was the mood leading up to the 2000 elections?
Tense. Very tense. Tension between ZANU-PF and the opposition had been building all through the 80s and 90s.
Driven by what?
Poor governance, the economic hardship we talked about, and increasing political violence. The 1990 Constitution did allow a formal opposition party for the first time.
But the 2000 election felt different.
It felt like a climax, yes. Big disputes over the electoral system, boundaries, all of that. And crucially, the main opposition, the MDC, organized these widespread and vociferous mass mobilization actions
To achieve what?
to spotlight what they saw as the government's apparent incapacity to safeguard the Constitution.
Joe.
It was a real show of force from the opposition, signaling declining ZANU-PF support. And right after those contested 2000 elections, the government launched the fast-track land reform program.
The more radical phase you hinted at.
Exactly. But implementing it turned out to be, as the sources say, more vexed than anticipated.
Vexed how?
It unleashed unrestrained violence against perceived enemies, widespread reports of gross and flagrant human rights violations.
And the economic impact of seizing the farms.
Disastrous. The division and poor management of once prosperous farms left the agrarian base of Zimbabwe's already shattered economy in ruin.
Leading to people leaving.
Yes, widespread exoduses. Both the experienced black farm workers who lost their jobs and livelihoods and the white farmers who were forced out.
So what do the sources identify as the root cause of the poverty then?
They're pretty direct. Bad governance is the primary cause of Zimbabwe's poverty. And they link it back further. The imposition of tyrannical authoritarianism at independence was the main reason for the country's decline into poverty.
Which led to?
Hyperinflation by 2003. Just out-of-control price rises and a truly desperate humanitarian crisis.
Given that downward spiral, how did Mugabe finally leave power, and what's the situation like now, politically?
Well, the end came in November 2017. The military stepped in, put pressure on Mugabe, and he eventually resigned.
Replaced by whom?
His former vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, took over. He and his cabinet came in promising change, promising respect for human rights.
Has that change materialized?
It's complex. The sources note that even now, Zimbabwe is still plagued by colonial legacy. National identity issues persist, particularly the marginalization of communities that were excluded from British civilization back in the day.
And how does ZANU-PF fit into this now?
The party, in consolidating its power over the years, has sometimes selectively embraced discourses on identity, highlighting colonial suppression, perhaps, to deflect from its own shortcomings.
With what consequence?
According to the sources, this has sometimes led to the exclusion of minority groups, rendering a large portion of Zimbabwe's population stateless and vulnerable. And that land debate.
Still going on?
Oh, yes. Highly contentious, even all these years after the Lancaster House Agreement tried to settle it.
And what about the economy during these really turbulent post-2000 years? Were there attempts at recovery? How did international relations play out?
Back in early 2000, international bodies like the IMF and World Bank were already sounding alarms, warning of critical dangers if the economy wasn't stabilized. Inflation was forecast to hit over 80%.
But relations with the West were strained, right?
Very. Condemnation came from the EU, US, UK over the land reform, violence, and human rights issues. But Zimbabwe didn't become totally isolated.
They looked elsewhere.
Exactly. They actively built new relations with China and Libya. The first China-Africa Cooperation Forum in 2005 was a key moment.
Marking a shift.
A definite shift towards a look east policy. China started providing significant loans and investment.
For what kinds of projects?
Mostly infrastructure and agriculture. And importantly, often without the political strings, the human rights or democracy conditions that usually came with Western aid.
That's a significant dynamic. And domestically, what about dealing with the opposition during this time?
That was incredibly challenging. There were attempts, like trying to form a government of national unity, and trade unions remained important players.
How did public opinion track?
The referendums held in March 2000 were really revealing. Nearly 60% voted against the government's proposed new constitution, and over 90% rejected its land program at that stage.
Wow, 90% against the land program.
Yes, it showed a major shift in public mood and really highlighted ZANU-PF's declining support base at that moment.
Okay, we've covered a lot of the political and economic history. Let's shift focus slightly to Zimbabwe's cultural heritage. Amidst all this turmoil, how has culture reflected the nation's identity and resilience?
That's a great point. Cultural heritage is increasingly seen not just as, nice to have tradition, but as an economic necessity too. It packages identity, belonging, spirituality, history, stories.
The soul of the nation, in a way.
Exactly. And traditional practices, things the ancestors did, were vital, even though early Europeans often dismissed them as mystical or primitive.
Were these traditions attacked during colonialism?
Oh, definitely. Sacred shrines were profaned. A stark example is the bombing of the hills of Shirugwi in 1910.
Bombing sacred hills.
Yes. It wasn't just destructive. It caused real panic among the colonial authorities because it showed how deeply these sites mattered. and it actually spurred resistance.
That speaks volumes. What about language and literature in Zimbabwe? It's a very diverse country linguistically, isn't it?
Incredibly multicultural. Over 20 indigenous languages spoken, mostly Bantu languages. Shona is the most widely spoken by almost 80%. Then Sindabel, Nabia Kalanga Sotho.
And English.
English is also widely used, yeah, a legacy of the colonial era, used in government, business, education.
Were the indigenous languages studied or promoted?
Some linguistic analysis was done by foreigners before independence, but serious efforts to standardize them developed writing systems. Dictionaries really only picked up more recently with bodies like the Institute of African Languages.
And post-independence.
Well, the new constitution aimed for a democratic society respecting diversity. But then economic pressures hit.
Like the structural adjustment programs.
Exactly, things like the GEAR program. They led to what the sources call commodification and marketization of education. Basically, budget cuts, school closures, fees going way up. That definitely impacted access and the vision of equality.
And finally, let's touch on music and art. How have they mirrored Zimbabwe's journey, especially since independence?
Independence in 1980 saw this explosion of celebratory music from Black musicians. But often, ironically, they were kind of ignored by the new establishment, and many traditional music venues actually got shut down.
Really? That seems counterintuitive.
It does. But one figure who really navigated this complex landscape was Thomas Mapfumo, the Lion of Zimbabwe.
What was special about his music?
He had this incredible ability to articulate what could not be said overtly. His lyrics often carried hidden critiques, even exploring what he called musical black-on-black conflict, addressing issues within the post-independence society itself.
Musically innovative, too.
Yeah, explored new harmonies, his band experimented, though they did drift a bit from purely traditional Mbira music over time.
Did his music change as discontent grew in the 90s?
Absolutely. His lyrics got sharper again, His band started openly lampooning the government, and around the same time you saw Njidi music emerge as a popular mainstream genre.
What's GD like?
It blends traditional rhythms and styles with contemporary sounds, kind of reflecting that vibrant, evolving, hybrid nature of Zimbabwean culture itself.
So wrapping this all up, we've covered so much ground: ancient kingdoms, colonial disruption, a tough liberation struggle, the complexities and, frankly, tragedies of independence. What's the big takeaway from Zimbabwe's story?
I think looking at the sources, the recurring theme is this immense story of economic, political, and cultural potential. Potential that was repeatedly denied and thwarted, first by outside colonial forces, but also by internal conflicts later on.
Leaving scars.
Definitely. The sources talk about accumulated traumatic scars on the people and the economy. They're significant and deep.
But is there a positive message in there, too?
I think so. The ultimate message seems to be that the lessons learned from Zimbabwe's really storied chronicle, its rich and often painful history, can offer valuable insights. Seeds with the fertilizers of wisdom, as one source puts it.
Wisdom for whom?
For other countries facing similar challenges, whether in Africa or anywhere else in the world, grappling with legacies of colonialism, conflict, and the struggle for development and democracy.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that history is never simple. It's always this incredibly complex tapestry, triumphs, struggles, legacies that just keep shaping the present.
Absolutely.
Listening to all this, what particular aspect of Zimbabwe's journey stands out most to you? And maybe what further questions does it make you want to ask or explore on your own?